Hi, everybody. Welcome back to She Asked Tools for Practical Hope. I'm your host, Anna McBride. In this episode, explore how grief isn't something you get over, it's something you learn to move with. If you've ever experienced loss or loved someone who has, this episode is for you. And please feel free to send this to and share this with anyone you think it would help, because that's what we want to do. We want to help as many people as possible. So I'll be using grounded research from Stroebe and Schute dual process model, as well as Neimeyer's work on meaning making. I'll guide you through what grief actually looks like in real life and how to honor your process, even when it doesn't look like anyone else's. Because you don't have to move on to move forward, and you don't have to do it alone. I'm going to begin by sharing a quote from one of my favorite poets about grief and a story, my personal story of grief. From the 13th century poet Rumi, love Rumi, goes like this: Don't run from the grief. O soul, look for the remedy inside the pain. His quote reminds us that so many of us think grief is the worst feeling possible, and that the only remedy is to run. Yet he reminds us that we need to look to the pain. That's where the remedy is. Love that quote. So here's my story. I've shared in previous episodes how I grew up in a dysfunctional family, how I describe it. It was also a family that had a lot of good things too. Two parents, a house with a roof over the head, and food on the table. We had all the essentials that way. Yet both of my parents were alcoholics. And with that addiction comes dysfunction. And I was affected by that. I was very codependent with not only my mother, but my siblings. And I coped with that situation with varying addictions myself. I took that upbringing, those practices, into my marriage. I married very young, the age of 21. I was married, really looking to escape the what I considered chaos of my upbringing. And I didn't know who I was. Who does when you're 21? And I thought I was marrying somebody that was the opposite of my parents. And as it turns out, he was a great combination of both of them. He wasn't an alcoholic. However, he came from a household where he was raised by an alcoholic. So he had similar traits that I did. And combined together, we created our own form of dysfunction. And we raised three children in it. We weren't completely unsuccessful. We, on the outside, looked like a very thriving couple, where his career kept progressing and mine progressed at a certain pace that suited our family dynamic and even our relationship. It was, my opinion, a lot about him. And I participated in that. I wasn't a victim. As the years progressed, our relationship grew in problem, grew in dysfunction. And 15 years in, we started separating. We separated for the first time, and we had three more separations before we finally had moved towards divorce. That was 36 years into the marriage. Before the end of the marriage, I had lost a couple siblings who had themselves become addicted to alcoholism and drugs of varying types. Two sisters specifically. One of them, her name was Candida, died 12 years ago. And my youngest sister, Tish, died 8 years ago. It was the second death that really took me to my bottom. I was very much involved in attempting to save her, along with her husband, their sons, my other siblings. We worked really hard to get my sister to rehabilitation, to health, and unfortunately, She wouldn't do it or couldn't do it, and then by the end, the disease took her. It was her death that is probably the most significant loss I've had when it came to someone I loved, and I've had some losses. I've lost both of my parents, and not that the other ones didn't affect me. I think I was just so invested in trying to save my youngest sister, and we were very close. That really affected me the most. So much so that I became depressed after her death. It was shortly after her death that my marriage really crumbled. Before the marriage fell apart, we all experienced in the world this thing called COVID. And before COVID, I had a very thriving therapy practice. I also had a yoga meditation studio that I was operating in partnership with other people who taught yoga and meditation along with me. And I had a cooking program as a part of that location. And because of COVID, it all shut down. So I had a big career pivot, another loss. And as I think about how these losses affected me, I thought, there's one thing that I can count on, and that's being a mom. I have 3 children that I'm very close with and love. I love being a mom. It's like the best favorite thing I've ever done. And now they're adults. I have twin daughters that are 35, and I have a son who's about to turn 31. So they don't need their mama as much as they used to. And I know that's the natural progression of life, yet I had become so connected to them, particularly as my marriage began to fail. I became more identified as a mother than I did as a wife. And so I view their progression in life, their needing less time with me, needing less care from me, as another loss that I have had in my life. So there are lots of different kinds of losses that we go through. Some of us lose loved ones, some of us lose jobs, some of us lose marriages, some of us lose positions, possessions, relationships. As my story illustrates, my grief hasn't come from just one place. It came when my marriage ended, when my kids grew up and the house grew quiet, when I had to rethink my career during COVID, and when I lost my sister to addiction. Each of those moments cracked something open. Some broke me wide apart. Some just left a dull, aching emptiness. And honestly, I didn't always know I was grieving because grief doesn't always show up with tears and funerals. Sometimes it looks like snapping at someone you love, or lying awake at 2 a.m., or feeling numb, checked out, or deeply tired. And for me, naming it as grief was the beginning of my healing. And that's where the research helped. It gave me language and structure and a little bit of sanity. In this next part of the episode, I want to share 2 models that reshaped how I see grief. One is the dual process model by Stroebe and Schute, and the other is Robert Niemeyer's approach to meaning making. Remember the original model, maybe you might remember, was Kubler-Ross. That came out in 1969. It introduced us to the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That was a great awareness provided to us that there were actually stages of grief. Yet there was very little at the time available as to what to do with that, what to do with those stages. How does one progress through them? There was just this clinical approach, and that was my experience. As someone who worked as a therapist, helping people to grieve through things in life, I struggled to be able to offer much guidance from that model. But contemporary grief research views grief as nonlinear. We don't just move through stages. People move in and out of these states, revisit them, skip some entirely. Newer models include the Stroebe and Schute dual process model of grief, and that came out in 1999. What I like about this model is that it emphasizes that grieving is not a straight path. It's actually a dynamic oscillation between two kinds of coping. So think of it as you're moving like a pendulum back and forth between a loss oriented coping and a restoration oriented coping. So, what does that mean? Loss oriented coping focuses on feeling the pain of the loss. It involves crying, remembering, yearning, or confronting what's been lost. This is what most people identify as what grief looks like. It's about leaning into heartbreak, not avoiding it. Being able to say out loud, I miss them. I can't believe this happened. It hurts so much. I wish I had that language when I lost my sister. I wish I had that language when my children moved on and forward with their life and needed me less. I wish I had that language when my whole business and all my clients along with it ended abruptly. I wasn't even aware of how much I missed what I was doing, who I was connecting with, who I loved. And it did hurt. It feels really important to be able to express that. Restoration oriented coping focuses more on rebuilding life after loss. They say that this kind of starts when we start to remember to take care of ourselves. It involves adjusting to new roles, making plans, solving problems, such as finances, parenting, alone, whatever the case might be. It's about engaging with life again, even in small ways like brushing your teeth, remembering to change your clothes, take a shower. I remember after my sister died, I'm a girly girl. I don't think I fixed myself up at all for days, weeks, it felt like. And when my marriage ended, I struggled to even get out of bed. And when COVID happened, I hid up in my farmhouse for a long period. The beauty of this process is that you go between the two states. What these researchers point out is that you're never in just one place. Grief is dynamic, it's personal, but very dynamic, meaning that we oscillate between the two. This movement is healthy and necessary. Getting stuck in either side, like constant pain or constant busyness, can lead to complicated grief, meaning if you notice that you're feeling stuck in one side or the other, like I was stuck in beds, holding up in my house, not taking care of myself, this is a red flag and a time to seek help. Some days I cry, some days I get stuff done. That is someone who is aware that they're oscillating between the two, and both are part of the process. If you notice that you're doing just one or the other, that again is a red flag to get some help. Now, let's talk a little bit about Robert Niemeyer's meaning making model of grief. And his came out in 2001, so it's even more recent. Niemeyer's model says that grief is not just about loss, it's about rebuilding the story of your life after that loss disrupts it. I love the idea that as a storyteller, we're all telling stories. And the story I was telling myself about all of these losses that I experienced in my life was that it was the examples of how I was failing in life. I failed to save my sister. I failed to keep my marriage together. Not very generous, yet that was the story I was telling myself. So, one point that Niemeyer points out is that the assumptive world is shattered. That's like the story narrative of most people going through grief. And so he wants us to name and claim what it is that we're experiencing. Because again, language matters. So some of the questions he prompts is, what is our grief story? Who are the characters? What is the plot? What are our core beliefs about what the loss meant? When we can identify those things, we can better understand and make meaning out of what happened. Because grief disrupts the core beliefs we had about life. Maybe we thought people would live forever. Maybe we thought we'd grow old together if we're married. Maybe we thought our children would always need us the way they always have. Maybe we thought a business would keep thriving the way I did. I was not anticipating any of those losses that I experienced. And I imagine any one of you out there that has experienced any form of loss would say the same. Even if you're anticipating due to illness somebody's death impending, it's still a shock when it happens. Or even if you know that your career is ending or you're, let's say, retiring, or that your children are growing up and going to college, it still comes as a shock, I believe, how it feels when they actually move on. We grieve not just the person or the experience or the thing, but the world we had with them, with it, with the situation in it. Yeah, we think the world is only complete when it has all the details that we like in it, our imagined future. Yet that's not the way life works, I've experienced. Life on life's terms means that we've got to be willing to face whatever's happening. And life in and of itself includes loss. The other part of this model is the meaning reconstruction. So, this is the active narrative reconstruction, the rewrite, in other words, integrating the past, present, and future. Healing comes from creating new meaning out of the loss. This requires healing work. I just want to be clear about that. Most people struggle to move through grief on their own. And this model of rewrite is something that you'll want to explore if you're going through it with a therapist or a coach, because it is very powerful. However, it is difficult to do on your own. This includes reframing the story. What did this loss teach me? Who am I becoming because of it? These are big questions, very powerful questions. Yet, when you're in the middle of grief, it's hard to see grief as something that deepens your compassion or helping you to trust life again, one step at a time. These are things that can come from experiencing grief. And again, they take time. So please be gentle with yourself. I can tell you from my own experience, I have learned more from loss than I have from anything in my life. I've learned the power of letting go. I've also learned that letting go doesn't have to mean that I am no longer connected with the people, the situations. When it comes to my sister, I keep her alive inside me because of the stories I tell about her. I reframe the story of my divorce with the context of what it taught me, how I grew, the woman I've become, the better mom that I am now, the better friend, the better woman, the better coach, actually. And I look at this pivot in life, that pivot that I got in COVID, along with everyone else in the world, as such a growth process to really prove my resilience. I had to navigate losing everything in order to gain what I've got now. And you can carry these lessons forward. Maybe not in the way that you would if you were still connected to these people in real life or these had those the work projects or your children still needed you the same way, but it's an evolved form. They're gone, it's gone, the situation's ended, but it's still a part of you. And this is the meaning that you can make out of the situation. It's a shift in perspective. And I got to tell you, as I said, loss is such a great teacher. Grief has taught me so much. It's really made me value life so much more. So we've talked about grief as it actually works, not in a straight line or tidy stages, but in waves. How we move between feeling the loss and slowly, bravely rebuilding our life. And I want to make a commentary about how our culture doesn't know how to hold grief. It doesn't have the patience for it. It doesn't even understand it. I think with this new research, we're learning ways in which to really understand how grief is very personal. It's as unique as your thumbprint. It's so personal. Each of us moves through grief differently. And just because our culture doesn't have the patience for it or the understanding of it doesn't mean that you need to do it in a way that suits other people. Really fight for the right to grieve the way that works for you. And this is why finding our own language, our own rituals, and even our own bookshelf matters at that time. What are we reading? What are we connecting with? How are we helping ourselves move through it? No matter where the grief comes from, grief will change you. And if you let it, it can teach you. It's taught me a few top lessons, and it's taught me this again and again. And these might be exactly what you need to hear right now. Number one, everything we love is impermanent. So live life fully now. I heard recently to envision someone you love when you're hugging them, someone you love that's alive. When you're hugging them, breathe them in, feel them in your arms. Really be as present as possible. And then, if you can go one step further, teach your mind this is a memory that I'm creating because one day we won't be connected, whether that's physical or emotional. There may be something that changes, and that's why it's important to remember how impermanent everything in life is. Grief carves into us the capacity to love even more deeply. It's crazy to think it that you have to lose something or someone in order to really to understand how much it meant to you. That's what grief has taught me. Two, your identity can be reborn through loss. So understand that we don't move on, we become someone new through the process of the loss, through the divorce, through losing someone we love. Grief invites us to meet the part of ourselves that is resilient, that is wise, that is unshakable. When we grieve the loss of a role, whether that's being a spouse, a mother, a daughter, a sister, we begin to meet the woman underneath. So, all of those roles that I've played, as I really consider the losses that I experience in those roles, I start to understand myself at a much deeper level. And that's what grief has taught me, that I am being reborn through those losses, growing deeper. The third lesson is that there's no right way to grieve, but you must let it move. Suppressed grief becomes things like depression, anxiety, illness. When my sister passed, I was really grief stricken. That lethargia, that not wanting to get showered or dressed or do my hair or makeup, not wanting to connect with anybody. I had to learn a way to let it flow through me. And the way I did it in order to honor my sister was I took a road trip with her ashes to the Grand Canyon in order to release her into the Colorado River, which was her favorite river. And that ritual gave meaning to the loss that I experienced with her. There are other rituals I've done. I've gotten tattoos of not only my sister, but I got a very meaningful heart shaped tattoo with the names of my children when I was very aware that they no longer needed me like they used to, but I needed them. So I marked them on my right arm. I started doing things like solo travel, where I hiked and did video clips and interviewed people in Spain, in Ireland, in Italy, not only to find a way back to myself, it also helped me find a way to this new place of storytelling So letting it flow, whether through tears, silence, movement, rituals, words, stories, this is a sacred act of soul hygiene and something that is really important. Your grief does not make you broken. It means you dared to love greatly. So, now to the tools of practical hope. Besides the life lessons, there are some books that I've read that have really helped me that I want to share with you. The first one is When Things Fall Apart by one of my favorite authors and Buddhist nuns, Pema Chodron. The subtitle is Hard Advice for Difficult Times. And it teaches radical acceptance of discomfort, fear, and loss as a part of spiritual growth. It encourages presence, to stay with your pain instead of running from it. And it also offers gentle Buddhist wisdom for surrendering to impermanence and uncertainty. Love, love this book. The second book, and this is one of my other favorites, is called It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. When I found this book, it was so mind blowing because it is a practical guide, literally practical guide on how to handle real grief. The author shares her personal story of losing her partner very tragically in a swimming event, and he drowned. And it completely turned her world upside down. And what she shares in the book at first is what she did within the first month, within the first 6 months, within the first year, within the second year, third year. She really expands it out. So it gives the reader some practical guidance as to what to expect. And she is a grief counselor. So she brings all of this experience not only from her own life, but also from the work she does with her clients. So it validates the depth of grief. No toxic positivity, no pressure to move on. I love that. She gives you permission to not be okay. She even critiques cultural myths about grief. It was from her, although I knew this as a therapist, but she's the one who reminded me that the DSM book, which is where we code all therapeutic diagnoses, has actually a code for grief, where they say that if you're grieving beyond 6 months, you're considered mentally unwell. Now, of course, that code was made decades ago, back when the Kubler-Ross model first came out. So this is back in the 1960s, yet it hasn't left that coding. I'll tell you that. I think it's funny because we now know that grief lasts a lifetime. It can, at least. There is no moving on. And our society is impatient with grievers, and we don't know what to say. And what I love about this book is it gives you practical things to say if you are grieving or if you're connecting with someone who is in grief. It offers realistic, compassionate verbiage. Those are the practical tools for not only surviving grief in this book, it also about how to honor your loss. She has some great rituals, journaling exercises. It's just a wonderful tool. Love, love that book. And it's great for anyone grieving a death, especially a stigmatized or complicated one, like addiction, for example, or feeling isolated in their grief. The last book that really taught me probably most about my grief related to my divorce is Untamed by Glennon Doyle. The subtitle is Stop Pleasing, Start Living. Why is it helpful? It's because it speaks to the grief of self-abandonment and the loss of roles, especially after divorce. Her life changed completely when she divorced, as most people's lives do. And she had to learn how to pivot in a big way, to be true to herself. It empowered the reader to reclaim their truth and rebuild identity from the inside out. It gives permission to the reader, to anyone grieving, to feel everything deeply: rage, sorrow, and liberation, and to let it transform you. It really was quite a great read because the one thing that I recall that she really focused on is this idea of returning to your wild state. That marriage had domesticated her, tamed her, and that becoming divorced freed her. And she was able to become untamed. I love that metaphor. So it's great for listeners navigating personal rebirth after emotional relational loss. So these are three great reads I highly recommend that you look at them, read them, enjoy them. So remember, grief is not a detour. It's not a flaw in the system or a failure of strength. It's love, reaching for what's no longer there. And in that reaching, we remember who we are. So wherever you are in your grief, numb, raw, rebuilding, or beginning again, know this: you're not doing it wrong. You're doing it bravely. And you're not alone. Until soon, you've been listening to She Asked, where healing meets practical hope. Be well.